Chapter 1. The Docks. The morning light slanted through the shutters of the seaside inn, painting pale bars across the wooden floor. Izzi sat at the edge of her bed, rolling her shoulder and pressing fingers gently against the line of stitches beneath her tunic. The flesh was tender, but the wound had knit well, just a faint throb now, nothing like the fire that had once made every breath an agony. She let out a slow sigh, tugging her long chestnut hair into a loose braid. Violet gray eyes studied her reflection in the warped mirror. Color had returned to her cheeks, the shadows beneath her eyes less severe. She almost looked like herself again. Almost. A knock came at the door before it creaked open. Hesta, the innkeeper, bustled in with a tray of bread and honey. Her broad smile and motherly fussing had carried Izzi through darker nights when the pain threatened to keep her sleepless. "You'll be right as rain in no time," Hesta said, setting the tray down. "Stronger than most who come crawling back from the edge, that's for certain." Izzi managed to smile. "Thanks, Hesta." "Bah." Hesta waved a hand, though her eyes shone warmly. "You and your friends brought enough life into this place to make the walls sing. Cerulea's rest won't be the same without you." Kaelen appeared in the doorway then, filling it with his hulking frame. He inclined his head politely to Hesta, then turned his scarred gaze on Izzi. "Ready?" Izzi rose, fastening her belt with its twin daggers. Her rapier was gone, left with Renlyn. "As I'll ever be." Downstairs, Horian was already leaning on the bar, sharing one last laugh with the sailors and townsfolk who'd grown fond of him. He embraced Hesta with a flourish, then winked at Izzi as they stepped into the salt-bright street. The tavern across the way stood open, its doors yawning onto a haze of pipe smoke and stale ale. Izzi's eyes swept the crowd within, but Sirius was not among the drinkers or gamblers. She pushed through anyway, her heart giving a small, traitorous flutter of hope. "Empty. Not here," she murmured to Kaelen as they stepped back into the daylight. "Check the beach?" Horian offered, his grin a shade gentler than usual. The three made their way down to the sands, the surf rolling in foamy crescents. Children chased crabs across tide pools, and couples strolled hand in hand beneath fluttering gulls. Izzi searched every face but found no trace of pale hair, green eyes, or that infuriatingly calm smile. Her chest tightened. "He wouldn't just vanish again," Kaelen grunted. "Wouldn't he?" They lingered until the tide began to climb the shore. Finally, with no sign of Sirius, they turned toward the harbor. The cries of gulls mingled with the creak of rigging and the shouts of sailors. The ship bound for the mainland bobbed at the end of the pier, its hull dark against the glimmering sea. Izzi paused at the edge of the docks, her fingers tightening on the strap of her satchel. The disappointment she'd held at bay finally spilled through her expression. Not anger, not quite sadness, but a hollow ache. "We wait," she said firmly. "If he means to come, he'll come here." Kaelen nodded, silent as ever, though his eyes never left her. Horian leaned on the rail beside them, the sea wind ruffling his hair. For once, he didn't joke. Together they stood at the docks, watching the horizon and waiting for a ghost. The sea air carried the scent of brine and tar, gulls wheeling overhead as sailors loaded crates onto the waiting vessel. Izzi stood stiffly at the edge of the pier, arms crossed tight across her chest. Her violet gray eyes scanned the bustle again and again, though she already knew she wouldn't find him. The longer she searched, the more her disappointment hardened into something she hated to feel: vulnerability. She pressed her lips into a thin line, willing it to vanish from her face, but Kaelen saw it anyway. His silence was steady, though the weight of his gaze lingered at her side. "Well," Horian broke in, clapping his hands together as if to cut through the gloom. "If he's not coming, he's not coming. The sea waits for no man or elf." His grin softened when Izzi didn't answer. "Best we board before the captain decides he's done waiting on us." He strode ahead with his usual flourish, waving to the sailors like old friends and stomping up the gangplank as though the ship had been built for him alone. Halfway up, he turned and cupped his hands to call back. "Come on then, unless you mean to stand there sulking until the tide carries us without you." Izzi exhaled sharply through her nose, uncrossing her arms only to cross them again tighter. Kaelen arched a brow, then jerked his head toward the ship. "He's right, let's go." Together they walked the gangplank, the boards creaking under Kaelen's weight, the salty spray rising to kiss their boots. Izzi's heart thudded heavier with each step, not with excitement but with a hollow echo of disappointment. Sirius had left without a word. That, she told herself, was all she needed to know. Then her gaze lifted, leaning lazily against the railing of the deck, one arm draped with effortless ease, was Sirius. His pale hair caught the sunlight like a crown of frost, green eyes glinting in amusement, as though he'd been waiting all along. "About time," he said, voice smooth as the sea itself. "I've been waiting all morning." Izzi stopped dead on the ramp, arms falling uselessly to her sides. The ache in her chest twisted into irritation, cheeks warming as she stared at him. Kaelen growled low in his throat. "You were here the whole time?" "Where else would I be?" Sirius replied. Horian's laughter boomed across the deck, startling a gull into flight. "By the gods, you sly bastard! Nearly had her tearing the beach apart looking for you!" Relief rushed in like the tide, warming Izzi's face despite the cool sea breeze. He hadn't left. He was here. She quickened her pace, boots striking the planks as she came onto the deck. "You should have waited at the inn, like we planned," she said, her tone sharp but her smile betraying her. Sirius tilted his head, the faintest smirk at the corner of his mouth. "Plans change." He shrugged as though the matter were nothing more than a shift in the wind. "I knew you'd be here." Izzi shook her head, unable to keep the small laugh from slipping out. "You're insufferable." "Perhaps," Sirius replied, green eyes glinting. "But you're the ones insisting we travel together." Kaelen muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse, and Horian clapped Izzi on the shoulder with a booming laugh. "Ah, there it is. A happy reunion at last," winking at Sirius. The ship's horn bellowed and the sails unfurled above them. Cerulea's Rest began to shrink into the horizon, the bright sands and laughing taverns fading into memory as the sea carried them toward the mainland. Izzi lingered at the rail, watching the last glimmer of white beach vanish, and let herself breathe. Whatever waited in Rivenholt, at least for now, Sirius was here. The ship cut steadily across the turquoise waters, sails filled with a steady wind, the horizon stretching endless and bright. Gulls wheeled and shrieked above before falling away, leaving only the groan of timbers and the slap of waves against the hull. Horian Hale had made himself king of the deck within an hour. Tankard in hand, he leaned against a coil of rope, laughing uproariously as he traded tall tales with a pair of weathered sailors. One moment he was describing a griffin hunt in the mountains, his arms flailing as though the beast might swoop down at any instant, and the next he was demanding songs from the crew, promising to teach them one's two body for any mainland tavern. Izzi couldn't help but smile at his easy charm. The man had a gift for making friends wherever he went, a warmth that filled the gaps left by all the shadows in her own life. Still, her attention was elsewhere. Sirius sat a little apart, perched near the rail with a half-empty cup of rum at his elbow. His pale hair stirred in the wind, his posture loose but his eyes always scanning the horizon, as if searching for something beyond sight. Kaelen leaned against a barrel close by, arms folded, scarred brow furrowed in his usual mask of suspicion. Izzi settled on a coil of rope, close enough that her words wouldn't be lost to the sea wind. "So," she began lightly, "going to stand there brooding the whole voyage, or will you share a story with the rest of us mortals?" Sirius's lips curved faintly, but he didn't bite. He lifted his cup, took a slow drink, and set it back down. "Not much of a storyteller." "That," Kaelen said, his voice dry, "is the truest thing you've said since we met." Izzi elbowed him, but her smile lingered as her gaze dropped, almost without meaning to the bandages wrapped around Sirius's forearm. She tilted her head. "Those markings. I've noticed them before." Her voice softened, curiosity threading her tone. "What do they mean?" Sirius glanced at his arm, then flexed his fingers as if the memory of the wound still burned. After a pause, he answered, voice low, "Mend. And move." The words carried a weight that silenced even Kaelen's sarcasm. Izzi leaned forward. "The runes?" "Yeah." He turned the cup slowly in his hands, green eyes distant. "I've had a good friend who could tell me what they mean, but I can't read them. Not yet." He tipped the rum back, draining it, and for once the smirk faded. "I'm headed to Rivenholt to meet with them, actually." Izzi's heart gave a quiet jump, and she caught Kaelen's eye. His brow arched, the faintest glimmer of interest breaking through his stoic mask. "Someone who can read runes?" Kaelen said under his breath. Izzi's lips curved into a small, thoughtful smile. "Maybe they could help us." Neither of them had to say the word artifact. The thought shimmered between them, unspoken but heavy, like the tide pulling them onward toward Rivenholt and whatever secrets Sirius was about to unravel. The wind shifted, filling the sails with a low snap. A spray of salt water misted the deck as the ship cut its path toward the mainland. Horian's laughter rang across the boards, but but Izzi and Kaelen kept their focus locked on the pale half-elf nursing his rum. Kaelen shifted, unfolding his arms and leaning forward, his tone as blunt as the edge of a war axe. "This friend of yours. Who are they?" Sirius didn't answer right away. He tipped his cup back, swallowed slow, then rested the rim against his lips as though weighing his words. At last, he lowered it and set the empty vessel aside. "She and I..." He paused, almost as if the thought surprised him. "We go back a long way. Longer than you'd guess." His voice softened, stripped of its usual mockery. "She's well studied, knows more about runes than any scholar choking on ink and dust in their libraries. A force of nature. Like me." Izzi blinked. In all their time together, she'd never heard Sirius speak of anyone with such warmth. The shift unsettled her as much as it intrigued her. Another woman, another piece of his past that didn't fit neatly into the cool, untouchable mask he wore. "You've never spoken of her before," Izzi said, her voice quieter than she intended. Sirius's lips quirked, but the smirk didn't reach his eyes. "The topic never came to pass." Kaelen grunted, unimpressed. "So she can read runes. That explains why you're bound for Rivenholt." But Sirius finally looked between them, his green eyes sharp but not unkind. "It's my business, same as your secrets are yours." He leaned back against the railing, folding his arms. "But since you're prying into my affairs, perhaps you should answer in kind." Izzi tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Sirius said, voice low and steady, "why are you looking for rune readers? What's your endgame?" His gaze lingered on Izzi, then shifted to Kaelen. "Fair trade, don't you think?" Izzi and Kaelen exchanged a glance. No words passed between them, but the weight of the decision hung heavy. At last, Kaelen gave a slow nod. Izzi followed, her throat tightening as she spoke the truth aloud. "We're searching for an artifact," she said. "A piece of something older than kingdoms, older than the histories we're allowed to read. The artifact of Thalen." Kaelen's jaw tightened. "Runes are the only map we've got. Without them, we're walking blind." For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the rigging and the endless rush of the sea. Sirius studied them, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not mockery, not smugness, but something closer to satisfaction. "Now we're getting somewhere." The deck rolled gently beneath them, the sails full and taut. A hush seemed to settle between the three as Sirius regarded them, the faintest shadow of amusement touching his mouth. "A legend, isn't it?" he said at last, voice smooth as the sea. "A story whispered in libraries and taverns. Something to frighten children into respecting the gods, or to keep treasure hunters busy chasing their own tails." Izzi bristled. "It's no legend." Kaelen's voice was firmer, steady as stone. "We've seen a piece of it. We had it, until it was taken from us." Sirius's eyes flicked between them, green irises catching the sunlight like fractured glass. For a moment, his expression was unreadable, but Izzi caught something there, recognition, or perhaps certainty. He masked it quickly with a casual lift of his cup, though the rum within was long gone. "I've heard the stories," Sirius said, his tone carefully measured. "The tales passed along by men too drunk to remember their own names. A shard of power scattered across the realms. But tell me, Izzi." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze holding hers. "Do you even know what it is?" Izzi hesitated. Her mouth went dry, but she forced the words out. "No, not exactly. Only that it holds power. Enough to change the world." A faint smile tugged at Sirius's lips, not mocking this time, but sharp and knowing. He let the silence stretch, the creak of ropes and the distant boom of Horian's laughter filling the space. Then, softly, he spoke. "It isn't treasure. It isn't even a weapon in the way you'd think." He straightened, his tone growing darker, edged with something dangerous. "It's a small thing, something you could slip into your palm, whisper to, and with the right words, topple a kingdom." Izzi's breath caught, her fingers tightening around her satchel strap. "Words can take lives," Sirius continued, voice low and deliberate. "Not a few, not dozens, thousands, across the world, if spoken just right." His eyes flicked to Kaelen now, his tone like iron. "And words can break. Any magic, Any curse, any chain, any past, any future. He let the weight of his words linger before his gaze returned to Izzi. But the truest name of what it carries is death. The sea wind hissed against the sails. Izzi swallowed, her heart thundering, caught between fear and fascination. Kaelen let out a sharp scoff, shaking his head. And here I thought it was just a legend after all. His tone carried equal parts disbelief and challenge. Sirius's gaze lingered on him, unblinking. Maybe it is, he said softly. Maybe it isn't. I just wanted to know if you were serious about it. He turned his eyes back to Izzi, their green depths unreadable. And if you still are? Izzi's throat tightened. She gave a single, firm nod. We are. Kaelen crossed his arms, his tusked grin grim. Sel. He caught himself before naming her, then growled instead. Someone already took a piece we had. That was proof enough. Sirius's smirk returned, faint and unsettling. He leaned back against the rail, the wind tugging at his pale hair. Then you're not chasing shadows. That's good to know. He let the silence stretch, then added almost as an afterthought. For myself, I wouldn't mind finding it either. Izzi narrowed her eyes, curiosity burning sharper now. Why? Sirius shrugged, deliberately casual. Another time, maybe. His smile carried no warmth, only mystery. But since we're traveling the same road, perhaps our goals align. For now. The sails boomed above them, carrying the ship ever closer to the looming shape of the mainland on the horizon. Izzi stared at Sirius a moment longer, wondering whether to press him, but his gaze had already returned to the waves, distant and unreadable as the sea itself. Sirius's gaze lingered on the sea, then shifted back toward them, thoughtful. Having a few good bodies beside me, he said at last, finding the artifact might prove easier. Izzi arched a brow, surprised at the concession. Then, with a faint curl of his lips, he added, Just promise you won't get caught off guard by sirens again. For a heartbeat, Izzi blinked, then let out a short laugh. The jab was unexpected, the first true joke he'd ever aimed her way. She chose to let it pass without sting, shaking her head. Don't worry. I learned fast. Kaelen grunted, but this time it wasn't disapproval. His scarred mouth quirked at the corner, as though he too recognized the shift. Sirius, guarded and enigmatic, was finally letting cracks of comfort show. Izzi felt it too, the weight in her chest easing. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to trust them. Then to the artifact, Horian's booming voice cut in, appearing at just the right moment with 3 mugs of rum snatched from the sailors' stores. He shoved one into Kaelen's hand, pressed another into Izzi's, and raised his own high. Sirius lifted his empty cup, tapping it against theirs with a soft clink. To the Thalen, Izzi echoed, her voice steady. Kaelen gave a solemn nod, and to seeing it before anyone else does. Sirius's green eyes glinted as he murmured the words last, almost to himself. To the artifact. They drank, the taste of salt and fire on their tongues, while the ship carried them ever closer to Rivenholt and to the dangers waiting there. Chapter 2. Arrival. The ship's horn bellowed as it cut into the harbor, sails furled and ropes tossed ashore. Izzi leaned against the rail, eyes narrowing as the docks of Rivenholt came into view. It was not Cerulea's Rest. The water here was murkier, a darker green that slapped against barnacle-crusted pilings. The upper docks gleamed with polish, fresh paint on timbers, banners snapping proudly in the wind, merchants shouting their wares beneath brightly striped awnings. It was the face Rivenholt showed to traders and dignitaries. Prosperous, bustling, clean. But beyond the cosmetic shine, Izzi's keen eyes caught the truth. Shadows pooled beneath the wharves where the tide sucked against stone foundations. Rougher ships sat lower down the piers, their sails patched, their crews grim-faced. Here, coin could buy anything, from contraband spices to human lives. She felt the weight of it in the air, thick and cloying like smoke. The gangplank clattered down. Sailors bustled to unload crates, shouting in a half-dozen tongues. Izzi, Kaelen, Sirius, and Horian lingered at the rail, the wind tugging at cloaks and hair. Well, Horian said, adjusting the strap of his pack with his usual roguish grin. This is where our roads part, friends. Izzi turned sharply. You're not coming. The ship continues north up the coast, Horian explained, his tone softer now. Another port, another job, you know how it goes. But don't mistake it for farewell. He swept her into a fierce embrace, his laughter hiding the hitch in his breath. "You'll always be welcome at Cerulea's Rest. Always. Even you, Sirius." Sirius arched a brow, the faintest smirk tugging his lips. How generous. Horian clapped him on the shoulder anyway, with the kind of force only he could muster. Generosity is what keeps the world spinning, friend. Don't forget it. Kaelen and Horian clasped wrists, the orc's deep voice rumbling. "Until next time." "Until next time," Horian echoed. With one last grin, he strode back across the deck, calling to the sailors with all the bluster of a man who refused to say goodbye. Izzi lingered, her chest tight as she watched him vanish into the bustle. She hated goodbyes, but this one, at least, came with a promise. When the three of them turned toward the city, Sirius lifted a hand, gesturing toward the rising sprawl beyond the piers. "There." His voice carried with quiet certainty. "The inn we'll be staying at." Izzi and Kaelen followed his line of sight, and their jaws dropped in unison. The building towered over the street, white stone polished to a shine, its balconies trimmed with wrought iron, lanterns glowing warmly at each corner. Carriages clattered past its grand arched entrance where liveried servants hurried to and fro. "That's an inn?" Kaelen muttered. "Looks more like a noble's villa," Izzi said, wide-eyed. "We can't afford that." Sirius merely strode ahead, unconcerned. From his pocket, he flicked a coin into the air, the same one Izzi had given him in Cerulea's Rest for the griffin hunt. He caught it neatly, then tucked it away again. "Already paid for," he said. "Your coin covered it." His smirk deepened at their stunned faces. "Drinks on me once our business is finished." Izzi shook her head in disbelief, a laugh slipping past her lips despite herself. Kaelen just muttered a curse, trailing after them as they crossed into the heart of Rivenholt, a city gleaming on its surface, but rotten beneath. The inn's doors swung open at their approach, a pair of liveried attendants bowing low. Inside, polished marble gleamed beneath their boots, and chandeliers cast warm golden light over velvet-draped walls. The air smelled faintly of lavender and citrus, not fish and tar, not sweat and ale. Izzi stopped just past the threshold, turning slowly to take it all in. Her violet-gray eyes widened. "By the gods," she whispered, "this is ridiculous." Kaelen grunted in agreement, though his tone carried a note of discomfort. He shifted in his simple leathers, clearly feeling out of place beneath the gaze of a dozen finely dressed patrons. "Back in our early days, we were lucky if the inn roof didn't leak on our heads." Izzi laughed softly, memories surfacing of drafty attics, straw pallets, and barkeeps who demanded coin up front lest they bolt in the night. "Or if the stew didn't poison us, or if the bedbugs didn't poison us," Kaelen countered dryly, and even Sirius turned to look at him in amusement. Izzi shook her head, grinning. "Strange, isn't it? After everything, we're starting to get used to this." She gestured at the gleaming chandeliers, the velvet curtains, real beds, hot meals, servants who bow. Kaelen's tusked grin was sharper, but not without warmth. "The road won't let us grow soft. Next time we're out there, it'll treat us twice as poorly, just to balance the scales." "Probably," Izzi admitted, her smile fading into something fonder, more thoughtful. But for tonight, she glanced toward Sirius, who was already speaking quietly with the innkeeper, arranging rooms without hesitation. Tonight, maybe it's all right to enjoy it. Kaelen followed her gaze, then shrugged, his voice lower. "If nothing else, it's nice to see him pretend to treat us." Izzi smirked, stifling a laugh, and together they followed Sirius deeper into the opulent inn. The city outside buzzed with trade, lies, and shadows, but within these walls, for one night at least, they could breathe. The innkeeper led them up a winding staircase lined with polished banisters and gilded sconces. Plush carpets muffled their steps, each landing opening onto quiet halls where the air smelled faintly of roses and fresh linen. At last, the innkeeper stopped before a tall oak door, polished so brightly it reflected their faces. With a bow, he swung it open. Izzi stepped in first, and froze. The room stretched wide, easily 3 times the size of the cramped attics she'd grown accustomed to on the road. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows draped with pale silk curtains. 2 great feather beds stood side by side, their quilts embroidered with golden thread. A carved wardrobe loomed in one corner, its doors painted with hunting scenes, while a tray of fruit and wine rested on a low table between plush armchairs. Its Izzi trailed off, her chest tightening with something between awe and disbelief. "Beautiful," Kaelen grunted, trailing her inside. He touched one of the beds with a calloused hand, pressing the quilt as though to make sure it was real. "Soft," he muttered. "Too soft. The road'll make us pay for this later." Izzi laughed, shaking her head, but when her gaze swept back across the 2 beds, her brow furrowed slightly. "2?" she asked, voice thoughtful. "Strange number for 3 of us." Sirius, standing just inside the door, raised a pale brow. Of course. One for you and Kaelen. He gestured, smooth and matter-of-fact. And the other for me and Priscilla. Izzi's ears twitched before her brain caught up. Her cheeks flared a soft pink. Priscilla, she repeated, her tone sharper than she meant it to be. For the first time in days, Sirius faltered. A flicker of surprise crossed his usually impenetrable mask, quickly covered by a quiet sigh. Apologies, I've not spoken her name in some time. She's the friend I told you I came here to meet. Izzi blinked, her blush lingering as she tried to recover her composure. She glanced at Kaelen, who was already narrowing his eyes at Sirius, tusks bared in a faint scowl. A friend, Kaelen said slowly. One you share a bed with? Sirius smirked faintly, though it was thinner than usual. Don't read too much into the arrangements. I'm simply anticipating her arrival. Izzi's curiosity burned hotter than before. The way he said the name, soft, weighted, carried a reverence she had never heard in his voice, and though she hated to admit it, a pang stirred low in her chest. Priscilla, she murmured under her breath, as though testing the name for herself. The weight of Priscilla's name still lingered in the air when Sirius turned from the window, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve. His green eyes were calm, unreadable once more. I'll leave you to settle in, he said smoothly. I'm off to find Pris. Izzi frowned. Pris? He inclined his head, the faintest trace of amusement in his expression. Sorry, Pris is a nickname. While I'm away, you may want to see to your equipment. Rivenholt has no shortage of blade shops. But there's one in particular worth your time. Redfin's Steelworks, 2 streets off the Eastern Square. Not cheap, but honest and quality gear. For this city, that's saying something. He slid past them with the ease of water flowing around the stone, already halfway to the door before Kaelen could open his mouth. When will you be back? Izzi called after him. Sirius paused in the doorway, his profile half-lit by the golden glow spilling through the windows. At sunset. Meet me here. Then, with the faintest curl of a smile, he was gone, the door closing behind him as though he had never been there at all. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Kaelen huffed, tugging at the strap of his shoulder guard. Shadow slips away the moment we arrive, and we're supposed to trust he'll be back. Typical. Izzi didn't answer right away. Her hand drifted to the hilt at her hip, the twin daggers sharp but insufficient. Her rapier, the weapon that had been part of her for so long, was gone, left behind in Renlyn's hands. The absence weighed heavily. Kaelen must have noticed the shift in her eyes, because his brow furrowed. How are you planning to pay for this new steel? Izzi touched the small pouch at her belt. The jingle was far too light. She smiled anyway, a mischievous glint returning to her gaze. If I don't have enough, I'll just have to turn my charm up a notch. She winked. Flash a smile, make a promise or two. Kaelen grunted. Charisma doesn't buy iron. And if all else fails, Izzi smirked, nudging his arm with her elbow. You'll cover the difference. After all, you're still sitting on that fat share from the griffin hunt. Kaelen groaned, but the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed his amusement. I knew letting myself get talked into that job would cost me more than scars. Izzi laughed, the sound chasing away some of the tension Sirius had left behind. She tugged her braid tighter, then gestured toward the door. Come on, let's see if this Redfin Steelworks is as honest as he claims. Together, they stepped out into the streets of Rivenholt, the din of merchants, clatter of carts, and distant toll of bells welcoming them into the city's heart. The streets of Rivenholt unfolded before them like a tapestry of color and sound. Cobbled avenues thrummed with the clatter of wagon wheels, the calls of merchants hawking their wares, and the scent of spices thick in the air. Cinnamon, saffron, and roasted meats blending into a dizzying perfume. At every corner, voices called out, finest silks from the eastern reaches, enchanted trinkets, luck charms that never fail, steel cheap as dirt, strong as a dragon's scales. Hands thrust bolts of cloth, baskets of fruit, and even live chickens in their path. Kaelen waved most of it off with a grunt, though Izzi found herself grinning at the chaos. She had spent much of her life moving through cities as a shadow, but this was the raw pulse of trade, loud and alive. Mercenaries lounged against doorframes, armor clinking, their eyes sharp for work. Mages in robes of deep indigo and crimson strolled past, charms glittering at their throats, the faint tang of ozone trailing in their wake. Street performers juggled knives for copper coins, children darting between their legs to snatch stray scraps. And then Kaelen stiffened before blinking in surprise. Across the square, an orc strode through the crowd, broad-shouldered and tusked, his green-gray skin marked by scars of old battles. He carried himself with the same wary weight Kaelen knew too well, but his gait was unbowed, unashamed. For the first time since they'd entered the city, Kaelen's jaw eased. His shoulders, always tense in cities, seemed to drop just slightly. He didn't speak, but Izzi caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. A reminder that even here, in the crush of stone and strangers, he was not alone. "Not so bad, is it?" Izzi teased, brushing her hand against his arm as they wove through the throng. Kaelen grunted, but his lips twitched into the faintest curve of a smile. They pressed on, guided by Sirius's directions. Eventually the noise dulled as they turned onto a narrower street lined with smithies and armorers, the air sharp with the scent of metal and smoke. A carved wooden sign swung above a tidy storefront. Redfin's Steelworks. Inside, the air was cooler, the noise of the streets muffled. Weapons lined the walls, gleaming beneath lantern light, swords, spears, and axes polished to a shine. Racks of rapiers stood near the front, their hilts glittering with engravings and jewel inlays. A man bustled out from behind the counter, his long apron stained with soot but his smile quick and eager. His eyes flicked from Izzi's lithe frame to Kaelen's towering bulk, and his grin sharpened. "Welcome, welcome, travelers I see. You've come to the right place." He rubbed his hands together, voice oozing charm. "Tell me, what are you in the market for? A fine blade for the lady? A heavier piece for the brute?" Izzi arched a brow, her lips quirking into the faintest smile. The way his gaze darted between them was calculating, already searching for the quickest way to bleed them of coin. Kaelen's tusks bared in a low growl. "Careful how you speak." But the clerk only chuckled nervously, bowing with exaggerated flourish. Of course. No offense meant, good sir, only eager to provide what you need. A discerning pair like you deserve the finest steel Rivenholt can offer." He gestured toward a rack of rapiers whose hilts glittered a little too brightly, their edges suspiciously dull despite their polish. The clerk's grin widened as his eyes flicked to Izzi's belt, lingering on the gleam of her twin daggers. He spread his hands as though unveiling a secret. "So? A light sword for the lady?" He gestured toward the rack of rapiers with a flourish. "Something elegant, sharp enough to carve a path and shine on any dueling floor?" Izzi's brows arched, and she rested a hand lightly on her hip. "Or perhaps..." The clerk leaned closer, his gaze dropping to her daggers. "New steel for those blades. I can see the wear, nothing lasts forever, even for one with your grace." Izzi smirked, more amused than flattered. "Or..." The clerk turned abruptly, clapping his hands together as his eyes fell on Kaelen. "Something sturdier for the gentleman. An orc of your stature shouldn't go without steel that matches it." Kaelen's grunt was low and unimpressed, his arms folding across his chest. Izzi tilted her head, her copper-streaked hair brushing over her shoulder. "I'm here for a rapier. It doesn't need to be perfect, just sharp enough to keep me alive." "But..." Her violet-gray eyes gleamed, testing the man. "I'd like to see your finest alongside your mid-range. I prefer to compare for myself." The clerk's grin nearly split his face. Of course. A wise woman, very wise. Let me show you." He bustled to the rack, lifting 2 rapiers and laying them across a velvet cloth on the counter. One had a gilded hilt wrapped in ornate wire, its blade etched with curling patterns, a showpiece that gleamed brightly in the lamplight. The other was simpler, plainer, the polish thinner, but still balanced well in the hand. "Here," he exclaimed, lifting the first with a reverent flourish. "A rapier fit for nobility. Gold filigree, fine grip, edge straight as truth itself. Nothing in Rivenholt finer." Izzi took it, testing the weight. It gleamed, yes, but when she ran her thumb lightly along the edge, it felt duller than it looked. The balance was off too, leaning heavy toward the hilt. Still, she masked her skepticism, setting it aside without comment. The clerk leaned in, his voice dropping as though sharing a secret. "And this one." He offered the plainer blade, more modest but still forged with care. "For someone who needs a blade to last." Izzi turned it in her hand, swinging lightly. It felt serviceable, better balanced than the gilded one, but nothing remarkable. "And yet," the clerk pressed, pulling her attention back to the ornate weapon. "This beauty, this will endure. A tad expensive, yes, but a quality blade built to last a lifetime. Surely a woman of your skill deserves nothing less." He watched her closely, eyes sharp, waiting for her to bite. Izzi and Kaelen exchanged a glance, then settled on the third blade the clerk had brought forth. Sleeker than the others, it looked better balanced, its steel catching the lantern light in a cleaner sheen. Not perfect, but more convincing. "This one will do," Izzi said, resting the blade flat on the counter. The clerk's grin widened, avarice flashing in his eyes. An excellent choice, my lady. Truly a blade worthy of you. Now, to settle the matter of coin. He slid the weapon toward the edge of the counter, palm open expectantly. A soft voice cut through the space like a breeze through still air. Ephraim, Sirius said. The sound of his name made the clerk stiffen. Both Izzi and Kaelen turned, startled, as Sirius stepped quietly into the shop. He moved like a shadow, his pale hair stirred faintly by the draft from the door. His green eyes flicked from the rapier on the counter to the clerk, then back again. You're not selling them this one, are you? Sirius's tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, sharper than steel. Where is your father? Where is the good steel? The clerk's grin faltered, his shoulders stiffening. After a beat, he swallowed hard. My father died 10 years ago. Sirius froze, the words hitting him like a blade to the chest. His posture faltered, just slightly, and for a heartbeat his mask slipped. He studied the young man, eyes tracing the lines of his face, the way his jaw set. Ah, Sirius said softly, almost to himself. Of course. It's been a while since I was last here. He tilted his head, his expression somewhere between disbelief and recognition. Ephraim blinked, his lips parting. I don't remember you. Sirius gave the faintest, wistful smile. I wouldn't expect you to. You were but a boy last time I was here. A silence hung heavy in the shop. Then, with a short bow of his head, Ephraim excused himself, disappearing into the back room. Izzi and Kaelen turned toward Sirius. For once, his figure seemed smaller, shadowed by something deeper than the present moment. A sadness clung to him, etched in the line of his jaw and the distant look in his eyes. I'm sorry, Izzi said softly. Kaelen gave a slow nod, his deep voice carrying weight. So am I. For your friend. Sirius didn't meet their eyes. He only murmured, Time goes by so fast. The words lingered in the air like smoke until the door at the back creaked open. Ephraim returned, cradling two blades carefully in his arms. They were different, finer. Their steel gleamed with a depth that spoke of true craftsmanship, hilts wrapped in worn but sturdy leather, each carrying a subtle elegance that needed no gaudy decoration. These, Ephraim said, his voice quieter now, tinged with both sorrow and pride, are the last two rapiers my father made. His final work before he passed. He set them on the counter reverently, running a finger along the fuller of one blade. I'll sell one to you, since you're the one who seems to remember him. But the other stays with me. It belongs to the family. Sirius's gaze lingered on the two rapiers resting on the counter, the lamplight glinting off their steel. For a long moment he was silent, as though weighing something more than the blades themselves. At last he lifted his eyes to Ephraim. Are you sure? Sirius asked quietly. Ephraim nodded, his jaw set but his voice steady. I'm sure. My father's work deserves to be used, not gather dust. One will stay with me, the other, let it find its road. Sirius inclined his head, a rare solemnity in his voice. Thank you. He reached out, taking the first blade with care, holding it up to the light. The first blade was long and slender, polished to a silvery sheen with faint ripples along the steel, evidence of careful folding. The hilt was wrapped in deep brown leather, softened by age, fitting the hand like a well-worn glove. The guard curled in a subtle, elegant loop, no ostentation, only purpose. It felt light, quick, eager to dance. Sirius tested the balance, nodding faintly. As fine as ever. He set it down gently, then lifted the second. The second blade bore a slightly darker sheen, the steel tempered to endure. Its fuller was etched with a faint, almost hidden line of runes. Not magic, but marks of pride, the maker's touch. The hilt was bound in black leather, firmer, stiffer, less forgiving to the hand but promising resilience. The guard spread wider, protective, ready to turn aside heavy blows. It carried weight, not unwieldy, but with the authority of something built to outlast its wielder. Sirius turned it slowly, his green eyes reflecting the steel. And this one. Strength and memory in every line. He lowered the weapon, setting it beside the first. His voice was quieter now, almost reverent. Both excellent, both worthy. He stepped aside, his hand gesturing toward Izzi. Go on, try them. The choice is yours. Izzi hesitated, her violet gray eyes flicking between the blades. Both called to her, one swift and graceful, the other steady and unyielding. She reached forward, fingers brushing the hilts, heart thudding as though she were choosing more than a weapon. Izzi's fingers lingered over the two hilts before curling around the first rapier, the dancer's blade. She drew it from the counter with a smooth motion, the steel whispering against the leather guard. The balance felt like an extension of her arm, light and eager, ready to move with her rather than against her. She gave it a short flourish, the tip cutting a gleam through the lamplight. "Yes," she breathed, her lips curving into a smile she hadn't felt since leaving her old rapier behind. "This one." Ephraim nodded, though a faint sadness tugged at the corners of his eyes. "Then it belongs to you." He named a price, modest, far below what the blade's quality deserved. Coins changed hands, and with a short bow, he slid the other rapier carefully back into its case. When they stepped out into the street, the hum of the market rising around them once more, Sirius cast a glance at Izzi's new weapon. His mouth curved into the faintest smirk. "He practically gave that sword away. You realize that, don't you?" Izzi tightened her grip on the hilt, smiling despite herself. Kaelen grunted as they turned down the cobbled lane. "And what about you? Did you find your friend?" The question made Sirius slow his steps. He stopped at the mouth of an alley, the noise of the market spilling around him. For a heartbeat, his face was unreadable. Then, finally, he exhaled and said, "About that." His tone was softer, tinged with something heavier than usual. "Things got a bit more complicated." Izzi tilted her head, unease curling in her chest. "Complicated how?" Sirius's eyes flicked toward the harbor, where gulls wheeled above the darker stretch of docks beyond the merchant quarter. His jaw tightened. "She'll be at the lower docks. Midnight." He turned back toward them, his expression unreadable but his voice steady. "For now, let's go back to the inn. Kill some time. I need a drink." The words hung between them as the crowd pushed and pulled, the smell of spice and smoke heavy in the air. Izzi and Kaelen exchanged a glance, both knowing this night would not end quietly. The common room of the inn glowed with golden light, the air filled with the hum of laughter and the clatter of silverware against porcelain. Soft music from a lute drifted from the corner, far gentler than the rowdy songs Izzi was used to hearing in taverns. The three of them sat at a polished oak table near the hearth. Their drinks arrived on a silver tray carried by a bowing attendant, a tall glass of red wine for Izzi, a heavy tankard of frothing ale for Kaelen, and a crystal tumbler of amber rye for Sirius. Izzi lifted her glass, eyeing the cut of the crystal and the delicately etched stem. "These cups are too fancy," she muttered with a grin. "Wine doesn't taste right unless it's in something chipped." Kaelen chuckled into his ale, while Sirius raised his tumbler with the faintest smirk. "You'll grow into it." Izzi rolled her eyes but took a sip anyway, savoring the warmth that spread through her chest. For a while, the three sat in companionable quiet, broken only by the fire's crackle and the muted chatter around them. But Kaelen, never one to let silence rest long when unease lingered, finally set down his tankard with a thud. "These lower docks," he said, his voice low. "What sort of business are we walking into? And this friend of yours, Priscilla, what's her situation?" Sirius swirled his rye, the amber liquid catching the firelight. He didn't answer immediately, and Izzi noticed the faint tightness in his jaw, the only crack in his composed facade. Finally, he spoke. "She got herself into a situation," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the flames in the hearth, as though the words burned to say aloud. "At midnight, she'll be put up for sale at the lower docks. A slave." Izzi's stomach twisted, her hand tightening around the stem of her glass. Kaelen's scarred hands curled into fists on the table. "She's the third girl to be sold off tonight," Sirius continued, his tone flat, almost clinical, though his eyes were sharp with something harder. "I'll bid for her, but keep your weapons honed and ready." His gaze lifted to meet theirs, steady and unflinching. "In case things don't go smoothly." A heavy silence settled over the table, broken only by the muffled clink of crystal and the low murmur of other guests. Izzi drew a slow breath, the firelight flickering in her violet-gray eyes. "Then we'll be ready." Kaelen grunted his agreement, his tusks bared in a grim smile. Sirius tipped back the last of his rye, setting the glass down with a quiet click. The weight of midnight pressed closer with every passing moment. Sirius set his empty glass down, his green eyes glinting in the firelight. "Good," he said, his voice low but firm. "Let's see how you use that new sword, elf." The docks at midnight bore little resemblance to the tidy merchant piers they had seen in daylight. The further they went, the cleaner streets gave way to rot and shadow. Lanterns hung on rusted hooks, their flames dim and guttering in the salt air. The smell of tar, fish guts, and rot mingled into a foul stench that clung to the tongue. Here the cobblestones were cracked, slick with slime where the tide lapped against the stonework. Warehouses loomed like crouched beasts, their shutters nailed tight, their walls scrawled with sigils to ward off watchful eyes. Small groups of cloaked figures emerged from alleys and side streets, men and women whose steps carried the same quiet purpose. Rings glittered on their fingers, chains at their throats, buyers. They moved with the smug assurance of those who knew the guard would look the other way. Izzi kept her head down, tugging her hood forward. Her hand brushed the new rapier at her hip, the twin daggers hidden beneath her cloak. Beside her, Kaelen's broad form towered, his greatsword strapped across his back, scarred hands curling and uncurling at his sides. Sirius walked a step ahead, pale hair catching the lantern light, the twin broadswords crisscrossed on his back, gleaming like the promise of violence. Together they slipped into the flow of buyers, shadows swallowing them as they were funneled toward a warehouse at the far end of the pier. A pair of grim-faced men barred the door, their arms like tree trunks, but one glance at Sirius's coin and they stepped aside. Inside, the air was thicker, warm with too many bodies, and sharp with the stench of sweat and fear. A single row of torches cast long, wavering shadows across the walls, revealing a cavernous chamber where a wooden stage stood at the far end. Upon that stage sat 3 iron cages. Within them, shapes shifted, men and women bound at the wrists, gagged, blindfolded. The scrape of chains echoed faintly as they stirred, the sound smothered by the hush of the gathered crowd. The captives' thin clothing clung to them in the damp air, their bare feet pressed against straw-strewn planks. The buyers clustered together, their silks and jewels flashing in the torchlight, their whispers a low murmur of wagers and speculation. Some carried ledgers, others heavy pouches of coin. Faces shrouded in shadow, they eyed the cages like farmers inspecting livestock. Izzi's stomach churned. She forced her expression into something cold, calculating, the mask of someone who belonged here, but her hands itched for the hilts of her blades. Sirius slowed, turning his head just enough to speak over his shoulder. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Stay sharp. If this goes poorly, steel will speak louder than coin." Then, without waiting for their reply, he moved forward. The crowd parted around him as if by instinct, his tall frame and the cross of steel on his back drawing wary glances. He pressed through until he stood at the very front, his shadow stretching across the stage. Izzi and Kaelen were left in the middle of the throng, their eyes tracking him, tension winding tighter with every passing breath. The murmur of voices stilled as 3 slavers stepped from behind the stage, cloaked in black, their faces obscured by scarves. The tallest unrolled a ledger with a snap, while another struck a staff against the wooden planks. The hollow thud silenced the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the tallest slaver intoned, his voice echoing off the rafters. "Welcome to tonight's offerings. 3 lots, each in fine health, each worth your gold. Let us begin the bidding." A torch crackled, chains clinked. The first cage creaked open. The first slaver tapped his staff once more, the sound sharp as a blade drawn from its sheath. 3 lots tonight," he announced, his voice carrying with the oily cadence of a practiced showman. "All in fine health, unspoiled and trained for obedience, but," his eyes glinted above the scarf that hid his mouth, "we will save the best for last." A murmur rippled through the crowd, greedy anticipation thick in the air. The first cage creaked open. A woman stumbled forward, bound at the wrists, her blindfold tugged free by the slaver's hand. Her hair fell in a dark curtain down her back, her skin pale and thin from confinement, though her eyes still glared with a spark of defiance. The slaver gripped her chin, forcing her head up so the crowd could see. "Lot 1, he said. Young, strong-bodied, and still spirited enough to keep her buyers entertained. He gave her a shake, making her stagger. Fit for household service or perhaps other purposes. Laughter and mutters rippled among the crowd. The bidding began at 50 silver. Voices rose quickly. 70, 90, 100 gold. Hands shot up, coin purses jingling. Izzi's knuckles whitened on her cup hilt. Kaelen's jaw clenched, but he forced his arms to remain crossed, his tusks bared in a silent snarl. At last, the bidding ended at 200 gold. A fat man with jeweled rings waddled to the stage, puffing with satisfaction. The slaver tossed him a key, the iron clattering in his palm. The woman was led off stage, her eyes darting wildly as she was dragged into the shadows. Lot 2, the slaver called, striking his staff again. The second cage opened. A younger woman stepped out, hair bound in a braid, her skin sun-browned, her frame wiry. She blinked rapidly as her blindfold was stripped away, her eyes wide and fearful. Skilled with her hands, the slaver said with a flourish, a farmhand, raised strong. But her youth makes her pliable. She'll bend to a firm hand and she'll last for years. The buyers chuckled and whispered, weighing her as though she were nothing more than a mule. The bidding started higher this time, 100 gold coins. Voices rose, sharper now. 2, 3, 4.5. Coins flashed in the torchlight, the sound of greed filling the cavernous space. The slaver grinned as the number climbed. At 500 gold, the bidding stopped. A cloaked woman stepped forward, her face hidden but her purse heavy. She caught the tossed key with a gloved hand, then beckoned sharply. The young farmhand shuffled after her, head low, disappearing into the press of the crowd. The slaver raised his hands, the murmur dying into silence. And now, his voice lowered, savoring the words. Lot 3. The finest of the night, worth more than the others combined. He gestured toward the last cage, his tones swelling with pride. Beauty, intelligence, and obedience, a prize any master would envy. Izzi's heart hammered in her chest. Kaelen shifted beside her, his great hands brushing against the hilt of his sword. And at the front, Sirius did not move. His green eyes were fixed on the final cage, his jaw set, his body taut as a bowstring. The slaver's key turned with a grating scrape, the iron door swung wide, the last cage opened with a groan of iron, its hinges shrieking in protest. For a moment, the torchlight showed only shadow within. Then, slowly, she stepped out. Each movement was deliberate, drawn out, as though the slavers had instructed her in how to sell herself even in chains. Bare feet brushed against the straw-strewn planks of the stage. Ankles delicate, calves toned, her body outlined in sheer black silks, so thin they seemed almost like smoke clinging to her skin. Every curve was emphasized, every step calculated to draw eyes and purses. Her skin was fair, porcelain touched with the faintest flush, and under the torchlight it gleamed with a fragile sheen, like moonlight caught in glass. Long curls tumbled down her back and shoulders, a cascade of pink-red that shimmered with unnatural vibrancy, catching the light in a way that made her seem at once youthful and timeless. Her hands were bound above her head, wrists lashed tight with rope, the posture forcing her shoulders back and her figure into sharp relief. The slaver tugged at the rope to make her stumble, chuckling darkly as the crowd murmured its approval. When he ripped away the blindfold, the torches caught her eyes, hazel, bright and searching, a depth of warmth that seemed out of place in this pit. For an instant, even gagged, she radiated something fragile, something human, before the slaver forced her chin up. Lot 3, he purred, his voice thick with mockery. A prize unlike any you'll see in this port again. Strong enough to work, beautiful enough for company, and compliant enough for other pleasures. He laughed crudely, running his hand across the rope binding her arms, drawing another chorus of chuckles from the crowd. A very good choice for those with salacious tastes. I almost regret not keeping her for myself. The buyers roared with laughter, coins already flashing in the torchlight as the first bids rang out. But Izzi didn't hear them. For a long moment, her gaze was locked on the girl, on Priscilla. She was gorgeous, too gorgeous for the filth of this place, too radiant for the smirks and laughter of the slavers. Izzi's chest tightened with anger, with pity, with something she couldn't yet name. Beside her, Kaelen's jaw worked in fury, his fists clenched white at his sides. And at the front of the crowd, Sirius stood perfectly still, his green eyes fixed on Priscilla, his expression carved from stone. Only the slight tremor of his hand, resting near the hilt of his blade, betrayed the storm beneath. The bidding began in earnest. The bidding began sharp and fast. 50 gold? 70, 100. The crowd roared with each shout, coin purses rattling, greedy eyes fixed on the bound figure on stage. And through it all, Sirius's voice cut like a blade through the din. Calm, controlled, always just a fraction above the last. 120, 150, 200. He never wavered, never raised his tone, never looked at the other bidders. His green eyes remained locked on Priscilla, as if no one else in the room existed. On stage, Priscilla's hazel eyes flicked through the crowd until they found him. Recognition flared, breaking through her terror. Even gagged, she tried to smile, her breath hitching in relief. The bids climbed higher, a fever gripping the crowd. 22, 25, 230. Then a cloaked woman's voice rang sharp and clear above the chaos. 600! Gasps rippled through the room. Heads turned. No one bid that high, not for a single girl. All eyes went to Sirius, waiting, wondering. Without hesitation, he spoke. 900. The room fell into stunned silence. A few chuckled nervously, others whispered about madness, but none dared challenge further. The slaver's eyes gleamed with greed, his scarfed mouth curling into a grin. "Sold," he declared, striking his staff against the stage. "To the pale swordsman at the front." He gestured Sirius forward with a flourish. "Come, sir, claim your prize." Sirius moved slowly, deliberately, slipping the straps of his pack from his shoulders as he ascended the wooden steps. The crowd leaned forward, murmurs swirling as the weighty sack clinked with the sound of coin. He tossed it onto the stage at the slaver's feet, the bag landing with a heavy thud. "My associates will count it," the slaver said with a sly grin, bending to scoop up the pack. "And once they confirm, you'll have your key." He dangled the iron key between his fingers, flashing it toward Sirius like bait. It happened in the space of a blink. Sirius's blade hissed from its sheath in a silver arc, slicing clean through flesh and bone. The slaver screamed as his hand fell to the boards, the key still clutched in its lifeless grip. Blood sprayed across the stage, hot and dark under the torchlight. Before it touched the ground, Sirius's other hand darted out, catching the key mid-fall. His green eyes gleamed, cold and merciless. The slaver dropped to his knees, clutching the bloody stump against his chest, shrieking in agony. The crowd erupted into chaos. Gasps turned to screams. Buyers scrambled, pushing and trampling each other in their rush for the doors. The air filled with the sound of shouts, overturned benches, the crash of coins spilling across the floor. On stage, Sirius stood unflinching amid the chaos, the key glinting in his hand as he turned toward Priscilla's cage. The slaver on his knees clutched at his ruined wrist, blood pooling across the stage. His eyes blazed with hate, spittle flying as he screamed at Sirius. "Do you know who you're dealing with?" The words rang across the hall, just as the heavy stomp of boots shook the floorboards. Hired guards surged from the shadows, mercenaries clad in mismatched steel, their faces hard and hungry for coin. Above, on the wooden balconies that lined the warehouse walls, archers notched arrows and drew their strings, all eyes trained on Sirius. Two of the slavers still at the cages barked out in unison. "Not at him! You'll hit the merchandise!" Their hands waved frantically toward Priscilla, her silks stark under the torchlight. The bleeding slaver tried to crawl backward, sneering through his pain. "You've just doomed yourself. No one leaves here alive." Sirius took one slow step forward, his broad sword glinting crimson in the torchlight. His expression was a mask of stone, his voice cold as the grave. "No," he said, "you won't." The blade sang as it cut, and the slaver's head rolled across the planks, eyes still wide in frozen rage. His body crumpled with a dull thud. From the side of the stage, one slaver leaned close to his companion, whispering with a smirk. "One less share, eh?" Then louder, barking to the mercenaries. "Go on then, earn your coin." The guards closed in, steel rasping free of scabbards, shields rising. Sirius calmly tucked the iron key into his shirt, fingers pressing it against his chest as though locking it into place. His eyes swept the encircling blades with no trace of fear. In the crowd, Izzi and Kaelen moved as one. Izzi's violet gray eyes darted upward, catching the shimmer of bowstrings drawn taut on the balcony. Kaelen followed her gaze, tusks bared. Without a word, they split. Izzi darted left, Kaelen right, weaving through the panicked buyers still shoving toward the exits. Both headed for the ladders bolted against the far walls, but steel barred their way. At the base of each ladder, a swordsman stepped forward, mercenaries placed to guard the archers above. Their blades gleamed, cutting arcs in the torchlight as they moved to intercept. Izzi didn't slow. Her rapier flashed free in a hiss of steel, her daggers already drawn in her offhand. She slipped past the first guard's heavy swing, her new rapier darting like a snake's fang. The point found the gap between collarbone and throat. He gasped, choking, before crumpling to the boards. She didn't pause, vaulting onto the ladder and climbing 2 rungs at a time. On the opposite side, Kaelen let out a guttural snarl. The mercenary lunged, blade high, only to meet Kaelen's greatsword in a brutal downswing. Steel shrieked, sparks flew. The smaller man staggered under the sheer force of the blow, and Kaelen's follow-through split him open from shoulder to hip. The body hit the ground with a wet slap as Kaelen's boots thudded against the ladder rungs, hauling his massive frame upward toward the archers. And on the stage, Sirius stood calm, his swords raised, the circle of mercenaries closing in around him like wolves. On the left balcony, 2 archers spotted Izzi sprinting up the ladder. They abandoned their aim on Sirius and swiveled, bows creaking as arrows were loosed in quick succession. But Izzi was faster. She vaulted the last rung, twisting aside as the first arrow sliced past her ear. Her rapier flashed in one hand, dagger in the other. She lunged low, the dagger burying itself beneath the ribs of the first archer. His gasp caught in his throat as she wrenched free, spinning on her heel. The second drew his bow again, panic flaring in his eyes. Izzi darted forward, her rapier's point darting and stabbing again and again, chest, side, shoulder, throat. The man staggered under the flurry of piercing strikes, crimson splattering across the balcony railing before he collapsed. Izzi stood, breath sharp, eyes blazing, her new rapier gleaming in the torchlight as though born for her hand. Across the room, Kaelen crested the opposite platform with a snarl. 2 archers loosed in panic, one arrow glanced off his shoulder, the other shattered against the stone wall behind him. Kaelen answered with a brutal sweep of his greatsword. The massive arc of steel caught both men mid-draw, splitting one clean through and knocking the other off his feet. The body slammed against the railing and toppled over, crashing down to the stage below with a sickening crunch. Kaelen roared, tusks bared, as he turned his gaze downward toward the chaos beneath. On the stage, Sirius stood calm, surrounded. 6 mercenaries circled, blades out, shields raised. Their boots creaked against the planks, their eyes flicking nervously to the corpses already at his feet. Priscilla knelt just behind the bars, her hazel eyes wide, watching the storm about to break. Sirius raised only one of his swords, his pale hair catching the torchlight, his other hand loose at his side. The first man lunged. Sirius sidestepped, the broad blade cleaving across his belly, spilling him to the ground before he'd even realized he was dead. Another rushed in from behind. Sirius spun, the blade whipping up in a silver arc that carved across the man's throat. Blood sprayed, the merc choking on his own breath before collapsing in a heap. The circle closed. Sirius moved through them like water, smooth, efficient, merciless. A parry, a twist, a downward thrust through ribs. A slash that opened another from shoulder to hip. One after another fell, their cries lost in the roar of panicked buyers fleeing the building. At last, only one remained, a broad-shouldered mercenary with desperation in his eyes. He roared and swung, his blade arcing toward Sirius's side. Sirius did not raise his sword. He lifted the back of his bandaged hand instead, catching the strike as if it were nothing. The blade shuddered, then stopped, quivering inches from his skin. The runes beneath the wrappings flared, glowing faintly, a light that pulsed through the fabric like embers beneath ash. The merc's eyes went wide, confusion and terror freezing him in place. In the next instant, Sirius's sword punched through his heart. The man's scream died in his throat as he crumpled, sliding from the blade. Sirius pulled the steel free with a slow, deliberate motion, flicking the blood onto the boards. Silence. Only the crackle of torches and the ragged sound of Priscilla's breath remained. Sirius turned, stepping to her cage. He reached into his shirt, drawing the iron key, and slid it into the lock. The shackle's gears groaned, then clicked. The bars fell open with a hollow clang. No words passed between them. The moment she was free, Priscilla surged forward, silks clinging to her as she threw herself into his arms. The chains fell uselessly to the planks, her bound wrists tangling against his chest. Sirius's arm came around her, drawing her close, his blade still slick with blood in his other hand. For the first time since Izzi had met him, a true smile touched his lips, faint, fleeting, but real. The slavers had scattered in the chaos, vanishing into the shadows of the warehouse's hidden corridors. Only one remained, a man pounding desperately on the barred back door, his fists raw, his voice hoarse with terror. They'd left him behind. By then, Izzi and Kaelen had descended from the balconies, boots crunching on blood-soaked planks as they stepped onto the stage. The scent of iron and smoke filled their lungs. Sirius held Priscilla close, though her gaze had already shifted past him, landing on Izzi and Kaelen. Her hazel eyes narrowed, cool and appraising. She leaned in, whispering something low in Sirius's ear. He sighed, his hand tightening briefly on her arm. "They're with me," he said aloud. Priscilla's expression soured, her lips pressing into a pout, but she gave a slight nod. Compliant, if not content. Kaelen's tusks glinted as his gaze flicked toward the slaver trapped at the rear, still clawing at locked doors. That one's not going anywhere. I'll take care of it, Sirius said, stepping away from Priscilla, but she broke from his arms with a sudden, feline grace. No, she said, her silks whispering as she moved. This one is mine. Izzi blinked, exchanging a startled glance with Kaelen as they watched her cross the stage. Her stride was almost playful, skipping lightly over blood-streaked boards, curls bouncing, as though she were a girl on her way to a festival. The slaver spun, his face pale and drenched with sweat. "Stay away!" he screamed, pressing his back to the door. "Stay away from me!" Priscilla's smile widened. She brought her bound wrists up, pressing her arms together, pushing the sheer silks tighter across her chest. "Oh?" she purred, her voice smooth as honey. "But I thought you and your friends wanted to do salacious things with me." The man's eyes went wide, fear warring with the memory of the cruelty he had boasted of minutes before. "No, stay back." Priscilla tilted her head, hazel eyes glimmering with mischief as she closed the distance step by step. She puckered her lips, mockingly sweet, and reached up to guide his chin toward her. Izzi felt her stomach twist. She shifted her weight forward, unsure whether to stop her. Kaelen's hand tightened on his greatsword's hilt. "Look away," Sirius said firmly, turning them with a steady hand on each of their shoulders. His voice carried the weight of command. The man's scream cut through the chamber, then choked off. A sickening crackle followed, the air filling with the acrid stench of burning flesh. From the corner of her eye, Izzi glimpsed a flash of fire bursting between Priscilla's lips as she pressed them to his. The flames poured into him, his body convulsing as fire raced under his skin, glowing red-hot veins crawling across his form. He burned from the inside out, his shrieks echoing until they broke into silence. When the body fell, smoldering and blackened, Priscilla stood over it. Her silks fluttered in the rising heat. She licked her lips delicately, then turned back toward the others as though nothing unusual had transpired. Izzi's breath caught. Kaelen muttered a curse under his breath, and Sirius only sighed, his hand running briefly over his face before settling once more into composure. "Come," he said. "We've drawn enough attention tonight."
Thank you for listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. More chapters are on the way.